My name is Lena Farber. I'm 30 years old. And the Sunday afternoon, my parents slid an envelope across the kitchen table and told me they had already distributed my bonus. Was the afternoon I finally understood that being erased quietly is still being erased. The envelope was pale yellow. It had been sealed and then opened again. There was a faint tear along the top edge where someone had tried to close it and then decided presentation mattered less than the message inside. My mother pushed it toward me across the table while my father sat with his hands folded and his eyes on a point just past my shoulder, the posture of a man who had agreed to this and now preferred not to be too visibly associated with it. My mother said, "We've talked to Dominic and Sophie. They know what to expect. Your bonus this quarter was $4,800, so we told Dominic he'll receive $2,500 and Sophie will receive the remaining amount. We left you the envelope to sign, so it's formal." I said, "You told them that?" She said, "It's decided." I said, "It isn't yours to decide." My father's hands moved slightly on the table. My mother said, "You want to fight your own family over money?" I said, "I want you to stop." My mother sat back. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator made its low sound and a branch moved against the window in the November wind, and my father looked at his folded hands. My phone rang. I looked at the screen. The name on it was Bauer Property MGMT. I answered. A man's voice said, "Miss Farber? This is Tom Howell calling from Bauer Property Management. I'm trying to reach the guarantor on the lease at Unit 4C on Meridian Street. We have a matter we need to discuss regarding the account." I said, "Yes. This is Lena Farber. I'll need to call you back within the hour. Is that all right?" He said, "Of course. We'll be here until 5. I ended the call. I set the phone face down on the table. My mother said, "Who was that?" I said, "Someone I need to call back." She looked at my father. He looked at me. I said, "I'm going to go. We'll finish this conversation another time." My mother said, "Lena." I picked up the envelope. I stood. I said, "I'll return this." I walked out through the front door, down the steps, and got into my car. I sat in it for a moment in the gray November afternoon, the engine off, looking at the pale yellow envelope on the passenger seat. Then I put the car in reverse and drove home. I should explain who Dominic and Sophie are before I explain what the lease means, because the shape of my family is what made the lease possible in the first place. I want to tell you what kind of person I was before the kitchen table Sunday, because the moment at the table was not something that emerged from nowhere. It emerged from 30 years of a particular family dynamic that had been running so long and so quietly that I had stopped noticing it was running at all. I grew up in the specific way that middle children grow up in families under financial pressure, by becoming functional. Not invisible. I was not invisible, but useful in a way that was noticed and relied upon without being formally acknowledged. I was the one who found the better deal on the school supplies. The one who knew where the spare key was kept. The one who remembered which bills were due and which accounts they were linked to, not because anyone had asked me to track these things, but because tracking them was a way of maintaining stability in an environment where stability was sometimes uncertain. My mother was an organizer. Thorough, responsible, and genuinely skilled at managing the logistics of a household. But she was also someone who had, over years, developed a specific blind spot. She was good at managing things that were already in the household, and less attentive to the distinction between what was hers to manage and what belonged to someone else. When she took on a task, she absorbed it fully, which was a strength in most contexts and a problem in this one. My father was less involved in the financial management of the household, not from indifference, but from the quiet deference of a man who has worked a steady municipal job for 30 years and has come to trust that the people around him will manage the things that need managing. He was warm and unhurried, and would do anything you asked him to do and fewer things that were not specifically requested. He had, across my childhood, been the person you told things to after the fact rather than the person you consulted in advance. Dominic had grown up with a different inheritance from these dynamics. The family's organizing attention had turned toward him early, not from a single incident, but from the accumulated weight of small moments in which his needs were more visible and more urgent and more rewarded when met. He was responsive to kindness, which made kindness feel useful, and the cycle had continued until he was 33 and had never quite had to develop the machinery for solving certain kinds of problems independently. Sophie had grown up later and softer, with more resource available than Dominic had started with, partly because I had, by that point, begun quietly filling gaps, and partly because my parents had refined their approach after Dominic and had become, with Sophie, more willing to simply provide rather than to require navigation. She was good-hearted and capable in the ways that mattered to her work, and genuinely underpracticed in the ways that would have required her to encounter structural inconvenience. I had grown up in the interstices, managing, tracking, filling the gaps that neither Dominic's more demanding presence nor Sophie's softer one required, and therefore going largely unremarked. I was not resentful of this, or had not been for most of my 20s. I had understood it as the arithmetic of family. The capable person absorbs more because the capable person can, and the margin between what they can absorb and what would break them is assumed to be larger than it is. What I learned in my late 20s was that the margin was not infinite. Dominic is my older brother, 33, and the person my parents had organized most of their family attention around for as long as I could remember. He was not, by any external measure, the obvious candidate for this investment of energy. He had changed his major 3 times in college, had worked at 4 different companies in 7 years, and had been in and out of living situations that ranged from a shared house with 5 roommates to a studio so small that he kept his bicycle in the shower stall because there was nowhere else for it. He was warm and funny and genuinely difficult to be annoyed with for long, which was perhaps the mechanism. He made it easy to keep helping him because he made it easy to be around him. Sophie was my younger sister, 26, still finishing a graduate certificate in social work that had extended past its original timeline by about 18 months. She lived with 2 friends in an apartment my parents had helped furnish, worked part-time at a community services organization, and moved through the world with a specific unhurried quality of someone who had always believed things would work out. They usually had worked out, not because of magic, but because someone, often me, sometimes my parents, occasionally Dominic when he was in a good patch, had made sure they did. I was the middle child. I had a degree in supply chain management and had been working as a logistics coordinator at a healthcare distribution company for 3 years. I was reliable. I was organized. I managed complex timelines for a living, which meant I was comfortable with ambiguity, but not with the kind of ambiguity that comes from never knowing whose name was going to be on a document until the document arrived. My parents were both retired. My father from a career in municipal administration, my mother from 24 years as a school librarian. They were not wealthy. They managed their own finances carefully and with the specific scrutiny of people who know that what they have is exactly what they have, with nothing in reserve. What they did have was a long habit of treating the resources of the family as communal, a habit that had been, when I was young, a reasonable reflection of how the household operated, and that had become, as I grew older and Dominic continued to need and Sophie continued to extend her timelines, something I was funding without anyone saying so directly. The transfers had not been large, individually. $80 here for Dominic's parking ticket. $120 for Sophie's course materials when the library waitlist was too long. A few hundred to Dominic the month his landlord raised his rent, and he needed a gap covered. None of these were formally requested. They were mentioned, in the way that things are mentioned in families where asking directly feels too stark, and I had transferred the money and filed it as family, normal, temporary. What made it not temporary was the lease. The small transfers had a long history and a gradual intensification. The first one I could clearly remember was the summer I was 23 and had just started my first full-time job. Dominic had been living with 2 friends in a shared house and had mentioned, at a Sunday dinner, that his portion of the utilities had come in higher than expected and that he was short for the month. My parents were managing their own transition. My father was approaching retirement and the household was recalibrating, and I had said, without being asked, that I could cover it. $80. Transferred that evening. Over the following 4 years, the individual transfers remained small and the frequency increased. A parking fine here. A course fee there. A month when Dominic's contract work had a gap and the rent was at risk. A month when Sophie's program had an unexpected materials cost. None of them were large enough to feel significant. All of them, together, represented something I had not fully calculated until I built a spreadsheet the winter before the kitchen table Sunday. The spreadsheet had taken me an afternoon. I pulled every transfer I had made to family members from my bank records over a 4-year period, categorized them by recipient and purpose, and ran the column totals. The total across 4 years was $7,340. The number was less than I had expected, and more than I had wanted it to be. It was not a sum that would impoverish me. It was a sum that had been going in one direction consistently for 4 years, without any formal acknowledgement that it was happening. I sat with the spreadsheet for a while. Then I saved it in a folder labeled Family/Overview and did not show it to anyone. The spreadsheet was not the origin of what I did later. It was the documentation of something I already knew but had not previously put into precise language. The precise language was useful. It converted a feeling, the low-grade awareness of a system running at capacity, into a fact with a number. Facts with numbers are easier to act on than feelings without them. What the spreadsheet did not capture was the guarantor arrangement because the guarantor arrangement was not a cash transfer. It was a liability, a different kind of resource, contingent rather than immediate, but real. When I added the potential liability from the lease, 12 months rent, that same figure, to the 4-year transfer total, the number that resulted was a fuller picture of what I had been contributing. That fuller picture was the one I had been carrying for 14 months. My work in supply chain management was largely about making the full picture visible, about tracking what was in motion, what was at risk, what had committed lead times that other systems depended on. A system fails not when the individual components fail, but when the people running it don't know what depends on what. The failure cascades from invisible dependencies, from the things that are running below the surface that nobody has thought to check. My family had an invisible dependency. They had built expectations around a contribution they hadn't named and a liability they didn't know existed. The kitchen table Sunday was the moment the invisible dependency became visible, not through my announcement of it, which would have felt like a performance, but through a phone call from the landlord at the exact moment when the envelope was on the table. I did not plan the timing. I have thought about this enough times to be certain of it. The call from Tom Heil was routine, generated by a quarterly automated outreach that Bauer Property Management ran for all guarantors on accounts with renewal inquiries. I had received no advance notice of it. It arrived at the moment it arrived because that was when the system generated it, not because I had arranged anything. What I had done was the preparation that made the moment mean something. I had read the guarantor form. I had saved the documents. I had kept the folder. When the call came, I had the information to answer it correctly and the composure to do so in a room where other people were watching. Preparation is not the same as plotting. It is simply the practice of knowing what you've signed. Dominic had been renting Unit 4C on Meridian Street for 14 months. He had gotten the apartment through a straightforward application that had one straightforward problem. His income and rental history were not sufficient for the landlord's guarantor requirement. The landlord, a property management company called Bauer Property Management, required a guarantor with verifiable income and a clean credit record. Dominic did not have a person in his life who met those requirements and was willing to sign. He had asked me on a Tuesday evening, in the parking lot of a grocery store where we had both happened to be at the same time, which was the kind of logistical accident that had characterized my relationship with Dominic for years, things happening in the margins of other things, never quite in a dedicated conversation with full attention. He said, "I found a place. It's good. I need a guarantor." I said, "What are the terms?" He said, "Month to month after the first 12. The place is $1,100 a month." I said, "What does the guarantor sign?" He said, "Just the standard guarantor form. You're liable if I don't pay." I said, "How much is the liability cap?" He said, "I think it's 12 months' rent." I said, "You think?" He said, "I'll send you the form." He sent it that evening. I read it that evening. The liability cap was indeed 12 months' rent, $13,200. My maximum exposure was that full amount. He had not missed a rent payment in any of his previous tenancies, which I confirmed by calling his previous 2 landlords, whose numbers I found on the guarantor form itself. I signed it. I returned it to Bauer Property Management by email with a scan of my identification and my 2 most recent pay stubs, as required. I received a confirmation from the leasing office that the lease had been executed. I created a folder on my computer labeled Dominic/Meridian and saved the executed lease, the guarantor form, and the confirmation email. I told no one in my family that I had done this. This was not a decision I made with intention of later using as leverage. It was a decision I made quietly, the way I made most decisions, by reading the documents, confirming the risk, and proceeding. I did not tell my parents because telling them would have converted a simple practical arrangement into a family narrative, and family narratives in my family had a way of becoming performances of gratitude that made me uncomfortable and that Dominic, in my experience, tended to oversell to his own benefit. I did it. I filed it. I moved on. The months I had been the guarantor on Dominic's lease were not dramatic months. He paid his rent. The account was current. I received no correspondence from Bauer Property Management except the initial confirmation, because there was nothing to correspond about. I had, during those 14 months, continued doing the other things I had been doing, the small transfers, the gap covering, the quiet subsidies that kept the family's surface smooth. My parents did not know the full extent of this, and I did not tell them. What they knew was that I was good with money, which was their shorthand for, she earns enough to absorb what we ask of her. What they did not know was that I had been watching the pattern carefully. Not from resentment, I want to be clear about that, but from the same professional habit that made me track my supply chains and flag the items that were running at capacity. A system running at capacity is not failing, but it is one disruption away from failing. I had been in that position personally for about 6 months before the kitchen table Sunday. The Sunday had started ordinarily. I had driven to my parents' house for the afternoon, something I did most Sundays, a habit I had not questioned. My mother had made soup. My father had been watching a game. The house had the comfortable particular smell of those afternoons, and I had sat at the kitchen table drinking tea while my mother stood at the counter, and nothing had announced itself as different until she sat down across from me and pulled the envelope from the side of the fruit bowl where it had been waiting. She said, "We've been wanting to talk to you about the bonus." I had received a performance bonus the previous Friday, the result of a project I had managed through a difficult logistics disruption that had involved 3 vendor changes and 2 missed deadlines that I had covered through 18-hour stretches across a 2-week period. The bonus was $4,800. I had mentioned it to my mother on the phone that Saturday, in the same passing way you mention any news, the same way I had mentioned Sarah Nachebi's salary to no one, because this was my life and not someone else's story. I had said, "Things went well this quarter." My mother had said, "That's wonderful, Lena." By Sunday, she had made a distribution table. The distribution table was in the envelope. It was handwritten, in her careful school librarian script, columns, figures, a line at the bottom that said, "Please confirm receipt and sign for our records." The table split my bonus into 2 allocations, leaving nothing for me. A notation in the margin read, "We thought you could manage on the balance," which was 0. I sat with the envelope in my hand for a moment. I read the table from top to bottom. I set it on the table, face up. I said, "This is my bonus." My mother said, "We know it's yours. That's why we're asking you to confirm it." I said, "You're not asking. You told them already." My father's hands moved on the table. My mother said, "Dominic has been having a hard time. You know that. And Sophie's program." I said, "I know. And I have been helping both of them. Consistently. Quietly. For longer than you know." My mother said, "Then you understand." I said, "I understand that you predistributed my money to my siblings before I was asked. I'm telling you that's not something I'm agreeing to." My mother said, "You want to fight your own family over money?" I said, "I want you to stop." The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator ran. The branch against the window. And then my phone rang. I want to be careful here about what the phone call was and what it was not. Tom Heil of Bauer Property Management was not calling with a crisis. He was calling, as I found out when I reached him 40 minutes later, from my own kitchen, because Dominic had submitted a renewal inquiry for Unit 4C, and the property management company, per their standard practice, contacted the guarantor to confirm ongoing willingness to remain on the account before processing any renewal. It was routine. It was not an emergency. Dominic's account was current. What the call was, in the context of my parents' kitchen, was a fact that had not previously been in the room. I had been the guarantor on Dominic's lease for 14 months. My parents had been trying to distribute my income on his behalf. They did not know that I had been providing a different and more significant form of support, one that was not money but was real liability, for 14 months without comment. When I called Tom Heil back, I told him I was aware of the renewal inquiry and that I would provide a written response regarding my continued guarantorship within 5 business days. He thanked me. I thanked him. I hung up. Then I sat at my kitchen table for a while with a pale yellow envelope in front of me and thought about the distribution table in my mother's handwriting and the folder on my computer labeled Dominic/Meridian. I thought, the table assumes I am a resource. The folder is a document. Resources can be redistributed. Documents are facts. I called Dominic the next morning. He answered on the 3rd ring, which was later than usual for a Monday morning. He worked remotely and kept variable hours. I said, "Hi. I need to tell you something and then ask you something." He said, "Okay." I said, "I was at Mom and Dad's yesterday. They gave me an envelope." A pause. He said, "Oh." I said, "You knew about the envelope." He said, "I knew they were going to talk to you." I said, "They didn't talk to me. They distributed my bonus and asked me to sign off on it." A longer pause. I heard him sit forward in whatever he was sitting on. He said, "I didn't ask them to do it that way." I said, "What did you ask them to do?" He said, "I mentioned I was short for next month. I didn't say anything about your bonus specifically. I think Mom," he stopped. "I think she got proactive." I said, "Yes." He said, "Lena, I'm sorry. That wasn't what I meant to happen." I said, "I know." A pause. "Here's what I need to tell you. I'm the guarantor on your lease." Silence. He said, "What?" I said, "When you moved into Meridian Street and needed a guarantor, I signed the form. 14 months ago. You asked me in a parking lot." He said, "I remember. I thought you were just doing the paperwork." I said, "I am just doing the paperwork. But that paperwork means my name is on your lease and my liability is 12 months' rent if you default." Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more careful. He said, "I didn't realize you'd think about it that way." I said, "I think about every document I sign that way. It's how documents work." He said, "Does Mom know?" I said, "No." He said, "Are you going to tell her?" I said, "That depends on what happens next." He said, "What do you want to happen next?" I said, "I want you to have a conversation with Mom and Dad about the envelope. I want them to understand that they made a decision about my money without asking me and that I'm not going to agree to it, and that making decisions about my money without asking me is not something I'll be available for going forward." He said, "And the guarantor thing?" I said, "That's separate. I'm not using it against you, but you should know it exists and you should know what it means. If I remove myself from your lease, which I can do with proper notice, you'd need to qualify on your own or find a replacement guarantor." A long silence. I let it run. He said, "You've been carrying this for 14 months. I said, "I've been managing it. There's a difference." He said, "Fair." Another pause. "I'll talk to them." I said, "Good. Tell them I'll come by on Saturday." The Saturday conversation in the kitchen took place 8 days after the Sunday envelope, and in the intervening days I had been careful and methodical about the sequence. I spoke to Dominic first on Monday because he was the one who had set the original chain in motion, and because I needed to know whether his account of events matched what I had observed. It did. He had mentioned a shortfall. My mother had moved to solve it, and the envelope had appeared between Saturday and Sunday when I wasn't present to be consulted. He had not asked for my bonus specifically. He had not anticipated that my mother would make a distribution table. He had been, in his particular way, startled by the consequence of his own carelessness, the carelessness not of a person trying to take something, but of a person accustomed to having things solved before he fully understood what solving them required. After Dominic, I waited. I did not call my parents on Monday or Tuesday. I let the space do the work it needed to do, the space in which my absence from their phone would register, in which the Saturday plan would meet the reality of my refusal. By Wednesday, I had a message from my mother saying she hoped I was well and that she was available when I was ready to talk. I replied that I would come on Saturday afternoon. She replied, "All right." The brevity of the exchange told me she had discussed it with my father and that they had settled into the posture of people waiting to hear what would be said. I spent some of the intervening days thinking about how to have the conversation accurately, not effectively, not strategically, but accurately. The distinction mattered to me. I was not trying to win anything. I was trying to make sure my parents understood what had been true for 14 months and what I was going to need from them going forward. Those two goals required different things. The first required facts. The second required clarity about the future. Both were available to me. I also spent some of the intervening days simply living my ordinary life, going to work, reviewing vendor contracts, making dinner, calling my friend Rian Hild on Thursday evening, and talking for an hour about a renovation she was managing and a book I had been reading, and the specific pleasure of a week that was almost, but not entirely, consumed by a single problem. Rian Hild knew the broad outline of my family situation and was the kind of friend who could hold a complex piece of information without either offering premature conclusions or pretending it wasn't there. She asked near the end of the call how I was actually feeling about the Saturday conversation. I said I thought it would be fine. She said she thought so too. We hung up, and I finished the book. The Saturday conversation had the quality I had hoped for, which was the quality of a conversation between adults who had things to say and were saying them. My mother's apology was not performed. It was the apology of a person who had been sitting with something for a week and had arrived, through her own internal process, at the conclusion that what she had done was wrong. My father's acknowledgement was quieter, but equally real. I had not had to argue. I had had to state the facts, and let the facts do what facts do when they are stated clearly in a room where everyone involved is capable of understanding them. The part that had surprised me was the soup. My mother refilled my bowl without asking, a gesture so small and so habitual that it was almost invisible, and which I recognized immediately as the thing she did when she was trying to say something she didn't have words for. I had been watching her do this for 30 years. The warmth of the gesture and the wrongness of the envelope could coexist. They did coexist. That was, perhaps, the thing worth understanding most clearly, that a person can love you and take from you simultaneously, and that addressing the taking does not require canceling the love. It requires making the taking visible, naming it, and establishing that it will not continue in the same form. The love continues. The form changes. The conversation with my parents on Saturday was in the same kitchen, at the same table, but without the envelope, which I had kept. My mother had made the same soup. My father was in the same chair. The surface of the thing was identical. What was different was what was on the table. I told them about the guarantor arrangement in the same way I had told Dominic, plainly, with the specific facts, in the order they occurred. I told them the date I had signed. I told them the liability amount. I told them that Bauer Property Management had called me at their kitchen table the previous Sunday because my name was on Dominic's lease, and that this was not a coincidence of timing but a fact that had been true for 14 months while they were making distribution tables with my bonus. My mother's hands, which had been around her soup bowl, moved to the table surface and rested there. My father said, "We didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't. I didn't tell you because I wasn't doing it to be known for it. I was doing it because it was what Dominic needed, and I could provide it." My mother said, "Why didn't you say something?" I said, because saying something would have changed what it was. In this family, when you name what you're doing for someone, it becomes a performance. I didn't want a performance. I just wanted Dominic to have an apartment. My father looked at the table. My mother said, "And the bonus." I said, "And the bonus is mine. I earned it during 2 weeks where I worked 18-hour days to prevent a logistics failure that would have cost my company considerably more than $4,800. You wrote a distribution table before asking me. I'm asking you not to do that again." My mother said, We thought you were comfortable enough." I said, "Comfortable has nothing to do with it. My income is mine to decide about. I can give generously, which I have, and I can also say no, which I'm saying now." My father said, that's fair. My mother said nothing for a moment. Her hands were flat on the table. Then she said, I'm sorry, Lena. The envelope was wrong. I said, yes. She said, I was trying to help Dominic. I said, I know. I have also been trying to help Dominic for 14 months without it appearing in any distribution table. A pause. He has a good apartment. He pays his rent. That is also a result of someone helping him. It's just not the kind of help that arrives in an envelope. My father made a small sound that was not quite a word. My mother looked at the soup. I said, I'm not angry. I'm just telling you where the line is. My father said, I hear you. I said, good. We finished the soup. My mother refilled my bowl without asking, the way she always did when she wanted to say something without saying it, and I let her because some gestures are their own kind of language, and I was not there to refuse everything. Sophie called me on a Wednesday. She had heard about the Saturday conversation from Dominic, who had heard about it from my mother. This is how information traveled in my family, in a chain, with each person adding a layer of interpretation, so that by the time it arrived at Sophie it had been through at least 2 translations. She said, I heard you told Mom and Dad about the apartment thing. I said, yes. She said, I didn't know you were on Dominic's lease. I said, most people didn't. She said, were you on mine too? I said, no. Yours went through Mom and Dad as guarantors. She said, oh. A pause. So, it was just for Dominic. I said, yes. She said, why? I said, because he asked and I could, and because at the time it seemed like the right way to help. She said, and now? I said, now he has an apartment and a current account, and I have the folder with his lease in it, and that's the situation. She said, are you angry at me? About the envelope? I said, no. You didn't create the envelope. She said, I took the money though. I said yes when Mom told me. I said, I know. She said, I should have asked. I said, yes. But you didn't know to ask. Nobody told you the full picture. A pause. I'm telling it to you now. She said, what does that mean? What should I do with it? I said, nothing specific. Just know it. Know that when money moves through this family, someone is generating it, and that person has a say in where it goes. That's not a complicated principle. It just wasn't being applied. She said, that's fair. I said, I know. She said, Lena. I said, yeah. She said, I'm sorry too. I said, I know. The months after the Saturday conversation had a different texture from the months before it, and I want to describe that difference accurately because it was not a dramatic difference, and it is easy to overstate it. What changed was not the warmth of the Sunday dinners, which remained. It was not the presence of need, which also remained. Dominic had his slow months, and Sophie had her timeline extensions, and my parents had their moments of financial uncertainty, and none of that resolved itself simply because I had had a direct conversation. What changed was the structure through which the need moved. Before the kitchen table Sunday, need moved through implication. Someone mentioned a thing in the presence of someone else who was capable of solving it, and the capable person solved it, and the implicit transaction was complete without any of its terms ever being stated. After, need moved through question. Someone mentioned a thing and waited for a response, and the response was sometimes yes and sometimes no and sometimes, let me think about it and tell you by Tuesday. Both versions were available. Only one of them allowed me to make a deliberate choice. I helped Dominic twice more in the following year, once with a specific expense I chose to cover, once with a referral to a financial counselor at my company's employee assistance program, a woman named Dr. Sandra Boateng who specialized in personal financial planning and who, when I mentioned Dominic's situation in broad terms, said there were options worth exploring that had nothing to do with family transfers. I gave Dominic her name and number and told him it was worth a call. He called. He came back from the first appointment with a specific expression of someone who has been handed a set of tools they didn't know existed and is trying to figure out how to hold them. That expression, on Dominic, was unusual enough that I considered it a reasonable development. Sophie's certification fee was the last direct financial transaction between us that went through my parents as intermediary. Everything after that went through Sophie directly, with terms we agreed to, which meant there were also sometimes refusals. Twice I said no, for reasons I gave her plainly, and twice she said she understood. The refusals did not damage the relationship. They established it on different terms. My parents adjusted more slowly than Dominic or Sophie, which made sense given that the adjustment required them to revise not just a practice, but a framing that had been their operational framework for years. The framing had been, Lena manages. The revised framing was, Lena decides. The distinction was small in language and significant in practice, and they arrived at it gradually, through a series of small moments in which they offered a need and waited for a response, rather than solving it before I could be consulted. My father got there first. My mother got there in the spring, when she mentioned a household repair and paused after mentioning it, visibly pausing, in a way that told me she was holding back the solution she had already begun to construct in her mind. I said I appreciated her telling me. I said I would think about it. She said she wasn't asking me to do anything. I said I knew. We sat with that for a moment, and then moved on to other things. The repair got sorted out without my involvement, which was also new information. The Bauer property management renewal proceeded. Dominic submitted his renewal paperwork, and I submitted a written confirmation of continued guarantorship, a decision I made after reviewing the account status, which remained current, and after a conversation with Dominic in which he said, straightforwardly, that he understood the arrangement now, and that he intended to qualify on his own at the next renewal opportunity. He said this in the flat tone of someone who has processed information and arrived at a conclusion, which was a tone I did not often hear from him, and which I considered a reasonable development. I did not remove myself from the lease. I held the position as guarantor until Dominic refinanced on his own 12 months later, after a promotion at his current company that raised his income to a level that satisfied Bauer's independent qualifying threshold. He emailed me on the day the new lease was executed. The email said, "Thank you. Done now." I replied, "Good. Keep paying on time." My mother did not make another distribution table. She came close to it once, about 6 months after the kitchen table Sunday, when she mentioned that Sophie's certification program had a final semester fee that was higher than expected and that she was thinking about who might be able to help. She mentioned it the way she mentioned things, in the middle of a phone call about something else, placed casually, waiting to see what it attracted. I said, "Tell Sophie to call me directly if she wants to talk about it." My mother said, "I can just." I said, "Tell her to call me directly." A pause. My mother said, "All right." Sophie called me 2 days later. We talked about the fee, which was $1,400. I asked her about her timeline, her plans after certification, and her current financial picture. She answered directly and specifically, which was more than she had ever done in a family-mediated conversation about money. At the end I said I could cover the fee and that she could pay it back over 8 months. She said she would. She did, all 8 installments, on the 1st of each month, transferred without reminder. That was a different kind of arrangement from anything we had previously had. Named mutual, with terms we had both agreed to, out loud, without an envelope. My father has retired for 2 years now. He and my mother have settled into a domestic rhythm that suits them, long walks in the mornings, a garden my father has started taking seriously, dinners that begin earlier than they used to. I see them most Sundays. The kitchen is the same kitchen. The soup is usually the same soup. What is different is what happens when money comes up, which it does occasionally because in a family with limited resources, it comes up. The difference is that it comes up as a question now, not as a table. Someone mentions a need. Someone else asks about it directly. We have, slowly and without fanfare, begun having the actual conversations rather than the versions of the conversations where the conclusion is already in the envelope. Dominic is in a different apartment now, a better one, on a higher floor, with better light, that he qualified for on his own with no guarantor. He sends me photos of it occasionally, the way people send photos when they want someone to see something. The most recent one was the kitchen window at dusk, the city visible through the glass, golden and specific in the October light. I saved it. I don't have a folder for it. It is just a photo on my phone that I look at sometimes and think, there it is. A thing that worked out. Quietly, over time, without anyone making a performance of it. Sophie finished her certificate in the spring. She is working now at a family services organization, a full-time position, salaried, the kind that comes with benefits and the specific relief of a schedule you can plan around. She called me the day she got the offer, which was the first time she had ever called me with professional news before she called our parents. I took that as information. I said, "That's excellent, Sophie." She said, "I know. I'm still absorbing it." I said, "You have time?" She said, "I wanted to tell you first." I said, "I'm glad you did." We talked for 20 minutes about the role and the team and the part of the work she was most nervous about, which was the caseload. I told her what I knew about managing a caseload from my own work. The same principles applied, different context, and she listened in the specific way she listened when she was actually going to use what she was hearing. We hung up. I made tea. I went back to the report I had been writing. Some things change in the visible ways, and some things change in the invisible ones. The visible change was the conversation at the kitchen table, the end of the envelope, the new arrangement with Sophie that had terms we both agreed to. The invisible change was slower, a gradual recalibration of what was expected, what was asked, and what was offered freely versus what was simply taken. That recalibration did not produce a dramatic moment. It produced a series of small moments, each of which looked like an ordinary conversation, and each of which was, in its own small way, a different kind of family than we had been. I want to say something about the folder labeled Dominic/Meridian, because the folder is the thing that people, when I have told this story, seem most surprised by, not the guarantor arrangement itself, not the phone call, but the fact that I had kept a tidy folder with all the documents and had been reviewing the monthly statements and had, at no point in 14 months, mentioned any of it to anyone. The surprise, I think, comes from a misunderstanding of why I kept the folder. People assume it was strategic, that I was accumulating documentation in preparation for using it. That is not what happened. I kept the folder because I keep folders. I keep them for every significant document I handle, vendor contracts at work, my own lease, insurance policies, the car maintenance records I have in a separate folder labeled CAR that my colleagues find slightly excessive. The folder was not a strategy. It was a habit. What made the habit matter in this particular case was that the document in the folder was one I had signed my name to, and I had always been someone who tracked the things I had signed my name to. This is not a skill that requires unusual discipline or foresight. It requires the minimum attentiveness that any signed document deserves, to know what you committed to know when that commitment is being drawn upon, and to know your rights within it. Most people do not read the documents they sign. This is not because they are careless, exactly, but because the documents arrive in the middle of other things, the middle of a move, the middle of a financial transaction, the middle of a conversation with someone who needs something, and reading them carefully requires a pause that feels, in the moment, disproportionate to the apparent stakes. The document is presented as a formality. It is described as standard. The person asking you to sign it is often someone you trust. I had grown up in a family where documents were formalities, where things were agreed to in conversation rather than in writing, and where the writing, when it existed, was understood as the paperwork that followed a decision rather than the decision itself. This was fine mostly for the things families agreed to in conversation. It was not adequate for a cosigner arrangement with a property management company. What I did differently from the norm was not remarkable. I read the form. I confirmed the terms with a financial advisor. I kept a copy. I checked the account monthly. These are the standard behaviors of someone who has put their name on a legal document. They are not special. They are simply practiced by fewer people than they should be. The phone call from Tom Heil was not the culmination of a plan. It was the natural consequence of having been, for 14 months, the person whose name was actually on the document, and who had been paying attention accordingly. There is a principle I use at work that I have come to apply more broadly. The person who tracks the system owns the outcome. Not because they engineered it, but because they were the one paying close enough attention to know what was coming. I had tracked the system. When the outcome arrived, at a kitchen table at the wrong moment, in the form of an envelope and a phone, I knew what it meant and what to do with it. That is not a special power. It is a practiced habit, available to anyone who decides to practice it. I think about the pale, yellow envelope sometimes. The careful handwriting. The distribution table. The line at the bottom that said, "Please confirm receipt and sign for our records." What it assumed was that I was a function rather than a person, that the money I had earned was an input into a system, and that the system would determine the output, and that my signature was a formality rather than a decision. What I did, when I said "I want you to stop," was not a declaration of war. It was a correction of that assumption. An insistence on being the person who decides about her own things, rather than the resource the system draws on. The assumption had been running quietly for years. The envelope made it visible. I said stop. And because I said it clearly, with the documentation to back it up if it came to that, they stopped. That is the whole of it, and it is enough. What you carry quietly will eventually be treated as permanent. The arrangement that has no paperwork, no agreement, no terms anyone has spoken aloud, that arrangement will calcify. It will become the way things are, and changing it will require more effort the longer you wait, because every month that passes is another month in which the people around you have organized their expectations around your silence. The way to stop that is not a confrontation. It is a statement of fact, clear, specific, backed by documentation if necessary, delivered at the right moment, to the right people in the right order. The envelope was theirs. The bonus was mine. The folder was mine. The distinction mattered. It still does. My name is Lena Farber. I am 30 years old. My parents slid an envelope across the kitchen table and told me my bonus had been distributed. I said no. I drove home. I called the landlord back. I had the right conversations in the right order. My brother has his own lease now. My sister paid back what she borrowed, 8 installments on the first of the month. My mother doesn't make distribution tables anymore. I still go to Sunday dinner. The soup is still the same. At that kitchen table there was an envelope with a distribution table in it, and my parents had already told my siblings what to expect. The phone rang before I could say another word, and what that call revealed changed the whole shape of the room. If you were sitting at that table, and you heard what my mother said, and you knew what I knew about the lease, what would you have said when the call came? Would you have answered it? Or would you have let it go to voicemail? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one. If this story stayed with you, give it a like. It helps more people find it. Subscribe for a new story every week, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. I'm Lena. I'll see you in the next story. My father has had the garden for 2 years now. He started with tomatoes and then, finding that he had more time than tomatoes required, expanded to herbs and a row of beans along the south fence. He is not a gardener by temperament. He is a careful, steady, methodical person who is a careful, steady, methodical municipal administrator and who has found that gardening rewards exactly the qualities he already had. He checks the plants in the morning. He notes what needs doing. He does it. I watched him in the garden the last time I visited, a Sunday afternoon in late September. The beans already past their season, the herbs still coming. He was moving along the row with his small notebook, writing something, the same deliberate attention he had always given to the things he thought were worth attending to. He looked up when I came out, and he said that the sage had gone woody and he thought he might try a different variety in the spring, and I said I had always liked sage, and he said he would put in enough for both of us. That was the whole exchange. It was not dramatic, and it was not instructive, and it did not contain any revelation about the nature of family or money or the correct way to handle a distribution table. It was just my father in his garden on a Sunday afternoon, noting what needed doing and doing it, and offering me something from what he was growing. Some things are that simple. The others require the conversations we had and the folder and the phone call at the kitchen table and the willingness to say clearly what the situation actually was. Both kinds exist. The simple ones are what you work toward.